I would begin with Dr. Laine Munir, who is currently a senior faculty at the African Leadership University and a senior research fellow at University of Rwanda. And she's also a 2021 Ari Frank Guggenheim scholar. She's a political anthropologist who's focused on the gender dynamics of environmental conflicts. Next is Dr. Andrew Grant, who I said will join us shortly. He is an associate professor and undergraduate chair of, in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. And Sarah, soon to be Dr. Sarah Wichler, is a PhD candidate in the conflict research group at Ghent University in Belgium. Dr. Andrew Grant focuses on, specializes in analyzing multilateral approaches and multi-stakeholder initiatives that address the governance challenges in natural resources conflicts. While myself, I look at the interplay of ethnicity and indigeneity in natural resources conflicts. Now, Dr. Mansour Assal, who I hope will eventually join us during this session, is affiliated with the University of Khartoum. So at this juncture, I would quickly just go through the ground rules for our presentations today. We have a total of 20 minutes for each presentation. I will notify you when we get to the 15-minute mark that you need to quickly round off if you're not close to doing so already. And if you have any questions for us, please, members of the audience, and even panelists that have questions for ourselves, we can send those questions directly to me throughout, the presentation via the chat feature of this platform. And I will collate the questions and then ask the respective presenters at the end of the presentations. So during Q&A. So Dr. Laine Munir, please, could you begin?
Sure, please. Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. So before I begin on my paper for today, let me give some background on my larger research project. So starting in January of this year, from January until June, I was collecting field data across Rwanda. And my general research question for my Guggenheim-funded project was to see how women in Rwanda fare during state formalization of mining practices. And then the paper I'm going to present today is actually one of 5 salient findings. I'm still working on the other 4, but one of the most clear findings was about the relevance of cooperative business models to change how women view labor, mining, law, and governance. So I'll just be talking about one of my main findings today. So that's going to focus on women in mining cooperatives in rural Rwanda. I'm still working on a flashier title. So to give you some grounding on just this particular paper, I was asking, one of several questions I asked in my larger research project was if cooperative business models mitigate some of the negative impacts on women of private mining operations. So when I talk about cooperative business models, or cooperatives for short, I'm really talking about worker-owned horizontal models in which each worker is also a customer and a stakeholder with one vote in the organization's decisions. And this can be contrasted with vertical business models of direct private company employment for mining. And most of the folks on this call are probably already familiar with some of the negative impacts that I'm referring to. A lot of the literature already shows us that mining can increase rates of physical violence, sexual violence, economic violence, structural and environmental violence against women who do the mining and women who live in nearby communities. So mining is a mixed bag, we found. So I really wanted to get in depth And I wanted to push back a little bit against this idea that I've come across that cooperatives are, by their nature, helpful for women all the time, and that formalization of mining is necessarily helpful for women all the time, which seems to be, I guess, the policy in Rwanda. So when I explored this question about cooperatives and women's outcomes, I really looked at three themes, and these are the three themes that emerge out of a literature review. The first question I wanted to ask was if cooperatives in mining help improve women's outcomes and financial outcomes and income levels. There is an assumption that that's the case. I was also interested to know if cooperatives might mitigate or lessen the types of violence that women experience near mining sites. And my third question actually harkens back. My PhD is actually in law and society, or socio-legal studies, the intersection of law and politics. So my third question was really about if the cooperative business model in extraction might have an impact on women's legal outcomes, their governance outcomes, and the way they view the socio-legal terrain around them because of the relatively, presumably, democratic nature of cooperatives. So to do this research this year, I sampled from 6 districts. Rwanda has 5 provinces, in all 5 provinces of Rwanda. And only 1 out of those 6 was a cooperative. And then 5 out of those 6 was a traditional private mining company. So I came to find this by looking at the interdisciplinary research on the issue. And so all of us are familiar with the idea of the resource curse in Africa. However, for people who do participatory action research or field ethnographies, we know that most of the research on the resource curse is top-down and studies government policy and international laws and GDP and these kind of macro-level measurements of mining outcomes. I like to think that my research is bottom-up or grassroots. I'm a political ethnographer, so I spend lots and lots of time in rural areas just having conversations and watching and thinking about women's individual lived experiences. So this research project comes within the context of the fact that Rwanda has had absolutely a staggering rise relative to its neighbors in its degree of mineral extraction, mineral export, and mineral revenue. So the Rwandan government currently tourism, let me back up. Before COVID, tourism was by far the largest earner for GDP. The government, even before COVID, was estimating that by 2022, minerals will constitute the majority of GDP as the largest earner. So at this same point, we have this rise in minerals in Rwanda. The strong Rwandan state is trying very doggedly to formalize and legalize mining operations. And that means transitioning informal. We try to not use the word illegal because it's derogatory and we know that law is a social construct. So I would say informal and artisanal small-scale mines and either shutting them down or transitioning them into legalized small-scale mines, and with the ultimate goal of having the whole country's mining operations be large-scale, mechanized, and even international or corporate extraction models. As a whole, the literature shows there is widespread support for cooperatives as a business model, and this is true among African governments aiming at development. This is true for INGOs, local NGOs, government aid agencies like USAID. Cooperatives are very attractive right now. They're feel good. And so Rwanda's efforts to formalize extraction economies comes at the same time that there is a lot of enthusiasm for cooperatives. So this development of mining and this development of cooperatives go hand in hand, really. And when you look at the research on cooperatives, there's pros and cons, good and bad. So proponents of cooperatives argue that they are compatible with these African values of collective outcomes, that if done well, they can provide state-like security mechanisms, savings and loans programs, insurance scheme, collaborative childcare arrangements, collaborative transportation arrangements to and from work. Proponents argue that cooperatives are relatively democratic. They serve as an antidote to kind of corporate oppression. And in the buzzword by the World Bank and INGOs, cooperatives are quote unquote women friendly. I think with this idea that horizontal power arrangements are better for women. So there are many critics of cooperatives though. Historians have argued that cooperatives are neo-colonial because cooperatives, in the sense that we currently think of them, first arose under colonial rule as a way for Europeans to extract higher agricultural outputs from its colonies. And in many countries, South Africa, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, they have been used for political purposes by political leaders. And in other research, specifically in the DRC, we see that cooperatives have just been labeled cooperatives, but they have these same unfair and unequal dynamics that marginalized women, no matter what you call them. So there's this idea that cooperatives just kind of give a facade of equality to inherently unequal labor relations, just with a new label. So I think my research and my literature draws on, I think, three bodies of studies. One is security studies, extractive studies, and gender studies. And I see my entire Guggenheim project is called Women, Conflict, and Modern Mining in Rwanda. And I see the WCMM project as being this star in the middle that brings together these different disciplines. So for my methods, qualitative field methods, so I would actually love some feedback and some guidance on from people who might have more expertise in methods than I do. So my entire research project was not a case study, but the outcomes from my in vivo analysis, I couldn't ignore Komakagi, this one cooperative, as salient. So for this single paper, I'm calling this a case study. And I had 10 one-on-one interviews in 6 different communities, so 60 interviews. Then each community yielded 2 focus group discussions. Then I had 2 days of field observations at each of the 6 mining communities, plus 2 days at a mining exporters in Kigali. And then I'm still working out how I want to approach my social mapping. So when I wrote my original proposal, I framed this research as social mapping research. And what that means is you use maps to help participants create geospatial representations of their experiences. So the idea is that in these mining communities, women would draw hand-drawn maps and they would point out sites of violence or sites of displacement, or they would show where their walking routes are, or where they would show where areas of environmental degradation were located. And then these maps would become a geospatial representation of their individual stories. What I encountered is the outcome of these maps, they are so cool, they are so beautiful, they are so aesthetically pleasing, they're so novel. I haven't figured out how to use my social maps as a unit of analysis. And so that might be my own lacking in mapping analysis experience. This is my first time trying to use social maps. So at this point, for the paper that I just disseminated for today's talk, I'm saying that my 3 methods are interviews, focus group discussions, and observations, and that my social maps served more as a conversation facilitator and a way to get textual data from my participants, but I haven't quite yet figured out if the maps are going to be their own unit of analysis. So I just need some time to work that out. My mode of analysis is I did content analysis is in vivo using 3 themes of the economic outcomes, violence outcomes, and legal outcomes. And I believe that I've been doing conceptual content analysis, which stands in opposition to relational content analysis. Conceptual content analysis I've always thought was traditional concept analysis as I remember learning it in graduate school. But I got some pushback. One of my colleagues said last week that what I do is thematic analysis, and his argument was conceptual content analysis is only when your textual data is secondary published data, newspapers, online content, public speeches. And he said that if your textual data is primary and you collected it yourself, it can't be conceptual content analysis, and that what I'm doing is thematic. I have some responses to that as well, but if anyone wants to help me work that out during the Q&A, I would really love that. And so for transparency of my scientific method, I put my 4 steps that I followed in vivo on the screen, and just to be transparent about what I did. So I would love some feedback on, I don't think I have a problem in my analysis. I think it was scientifically rigorous. I think I'm just having a labeling problem. So of course, my favorite slide of all, my findings. The first one is not surprising, is that women report their lives are better with mining than they would be without it. So my single most salient finding across the board with every participant is that she makes more money because of mining than she would without mining, and far more than she would in farming. Even if her mining is seasonal or part-time, or even if she doesn't work in mining but has a knockoff job, you know, cooking or cleaning or doing other things that supports the mining industry, Rwandan women want mining. And this stands in contrast to what I found in my doctoral research on women in the Niger Delta oil conflict. I spent a year in the Niger Delta, and there the message was very different from women. Nigerian women were saying, oil has destroyed the land and brought me no benefits, and I don't earn enough, even in my knockoff jobs. And if things don't get better, I want the oil company to leave. So Nigerian women absolutely are willing to have the oil industry wither. Rwandan women are not. So it was almost opposite findings. My first unique finding is I did not find in vivo any evidence that the cooperative necessarily increases women's income more than private company employment. Now, I will say the few women I talked to who earned the most did work for the cooperative, but they were also the women who happened to have office jobs. But that's not because the cooperative hires women for office and leadership roles more than private companies. That was just kind of a fluke of my sampling. To give you some context, the lowest income I had among any respondent was 500 Rwandan francs a day, which is half a US dollar, for just working a couple hours in the morning part-time. The average income for a woman in mining is about $2 a day. And some of the women in leadership positions, both in the cooperative and in mining companies, earned around $4 a day. One woman earned $5 a day because they were in what's considered to be by them a higher skilled job with more office responsibilities. But there was no pattern of women in cooperatives earning more money. My second original finding is I also did not find any evidence that cooperatives reduce women's experiences with physical violence or sexual violence. And in fact, women in my cooperative community reported far higher rates of transactional sex than women who worked in private company employment. I mean, the embeddedness and the frequency for the Komakagi cooperative for transactional sex was like 7 or 8 times higher than any other community. There was no comparison. A few paragraphs of my paper actually explores how this could be. Why would transactional sex be more common in cooperatives, with the assumption also that transactional sex is very rarely in women's best interest and not voluntary. My last unique finding is what I called expanded legal consciousness. So women in the cooperative spoke so much more frequently and with so much more detail about their role in the global supply chain, their role in the cooperative and the company and in local governance. They talked a lot about every single woman knew where she would take her problems related to mining, whereas many other women in private company employment said they didn't know how to get their problems solved. And the women in the cooperative had a sense of, I would say, like really important entitlement to their rights and a living wage and being treated well that I didn't find in my other communities where women work for private companies. So I had called that expanded legal consciousness. And legal consciousness is kind of the mental models that we have for the socio-legal terrain that we navigate in our communities in relation to law and governance. So as I conclude, I think what comes out of this cooperative case study is that it feels really good to herald cooperatives as a beacon for economic development for marginalized workers, but they are not by course beneficial for women. And we also need to hesitate with the idea that formalization and legalization of economic activities is necessarily in women's best interest. And based on my outcomes, legalization only helps women if it's also part of local level equality policies and programming. So for the women that I've been working with for the last year, their outcomes are not based on Rwanda's national gender equality policy. Their outcomes are based on their local leaders, local norms and expectations around gender. The local is much more salient than anything else. And then my last unique finding, which I hope to develop into its own paper for the Law and Society Association, is that there may be what I call aspirational or indirect benefits of cooperatives on women's sense of legal consciousness and fair governance and kind of a rights and legal awareness, which if you study social movements, you know can often be really helpful for helping marginalized workers if they ever need to collectively get together to improve their lot. So thank you. That wraps up my slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions or field any criticisms or comments during the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Munir, for your excellent presentation. Please, if you have any question for Dr. Munir, please send it to me through the chat feature of this platform, as I mentioned earlier. And I will read out the question during Q&A. Sarah, could you please prepare to present your paper? So Sarah will be will be presenting on how historical legacies of land grab shape contemporary land conflicts in a Ugandan region. Sarah, please.
Thank you. Let me just share the screen. All right. Whoa. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. My name is Sarah Weschler. I'm a PhD candidate